I want to begin with just a brief passage, a word of prayer. I want to introduce our speaker, and then we'll go over how we're going to do this in this next hour. So as we think about this topic, talking about race, of course, Scripture is full of passages that remind us how incredibly important this is. Our diversity is indeed a gift. For in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we hear, "For just as a body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ." So it is with Christ. "For in the one Spirit, we are all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we are all made to drink of the one Spirit." And so during this time, I am going to invite us to set aside our own, whether it's guilt or baggage or presumptions or whatever it is that we all carry into all of our settings and interactions with people, and drink in the Spirit with a sense of humility and openness. Let's put our defenses aside and just drink in the Spirit and hear where the Spirit is leading us this day as we embark on these conversations talking about race. Sorry, I forgot to silence my cell phone. So let us pray. Gracious and loving God, you have created an incredibly diverse world and people, and you have given us this world as a gift. You have given one another to us as a gift. And yet, instead of receiving this as a gift, we put up barriers and walls and divisions, and we categorize and separate, and your heart grieves. And we ask that in these days, when it is difficult to talk honestly and openly with one another, we would continue to breathe in your Spirit, so that your Spirit may guide us to hear, to be one, to experience the incredible gift of your creation. Help us to honor each and every person, to hear with respect and openness, and to honor our own feelings, for your Spirit is at work in us. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, I want to introduce our presenter. Many of you, and Terrence, you can wave so that we know that it's you I'm talking about. Terrence Freeman is a retired professor of mechanical engineering. He is a founder of TransEd, Transitional Education and Consulting Services. He has over 30 years of local and national experience as a facilitator and trainer in diversity and inclusion with a World of Difference Institute. He currently serves as the National Youth Conference Coordinator for 100 Black Men of America. He's also the council president at St. Philip's Evangelical Lutheran Church in St. Louis. He is a member of the Central States Synod Council and the Eastern Missouri Conference Strategy Team. So, Terrence.
We are about to embark on what I kind of affectionately refer to as a drive-by. Normally, if we're doing a workshop in diversity and inclusion, that we would ideally like to have a full week of residential activity. But typically, a robust workshop would be about 8 hours long. Then, if we have a painful excision of relevant information and activities, we can reduce it to about 4 hours. Anything under 2 hours, I just consider it to be what I call a drive-by. And that would be typically because I would be doing it in person and I would have rolled onto the parking lot, shared some information, a little bit of interaction, hopped in my car, drove off, not having any idea of what the impact was. But now I guess I'll have to call this a Zoom by. So we're going to cover what we can, and any type of workshop, the power is not really in the workshop. The power is how we can provoke thought, inspire action, and what happens after a workshop. So hopefully over the next now 55 minutes, we can have just a little thought provocation, and we'll go from there. I'll try to save some time for questions. We'll see how that goes. That when we're talking about diversity, and I like to lay a little bit of foundation in this, because I'm reminded that it's always more than what we see. It's always more than what we see. And each of us, and we'll have a little brief exercise on that later, but when we're looking at what we typically refer to as diversity, we're talking about race, gender, age, physical ability, appearance. Those are things that are above, in this iceberg metaphor, the waterline. They're the things that we see. But much of the damage that is done in a cultural collision is on, just like the iceberg, is beneath the surface. The things that we don't see. The things that we don't see, we frequently attribute to the things that we do see. So there are things that sometimes we see them, sometimes we don't. Religion, class, job function, sexual orientation, that unless you are doing something or wearing something, unless you have a badge on that, or a polo shirt that's announcing something, we don't typically know these things. We might suspect them, we might guess them, but again, when we don't know, we assign it to those things that we do see or that we do know. And then a lot of the challenge is in ethnicity, which is different from race, family status, education, employee status, regional origin, communication style, thinking style, personality, all of those things that are there. And I could just ask, now, how many of you are the oldest child? And I won't be able to have the interaction where I see a show of hands. And how many of you are the youngest child, or the middle child, or the only child? And that is, and if you're the baby, then you may retain baby status forever. My aunt passed last year at the age of 93. And at the age of 93, even though all of her older siblings had passed, she was still baby Jean. That's because that's how she grew up. And so some of those things influence who we are and how we act, but we don't necessarily see them, and then we end up falsely attributing them to things that we don't see. Just to share as a brief story, in my background growing up, I thought that old people were cheap, because my experience with older people was that they were in fact cheap. What I didn't realize is that when they were young, because the old people to me when I was growing up grew up in the Depression. They're cheap when they were young. And so it wasn't a factor of age where I had it attributed to that. It was the situation, the circumstance, the experiences they had accumulated that informed a lot of their behavior. So what we're going to attempt to do, we're not going to have introductions, but go over just a little bit of the purpose, the goals, the rationale, some ground rules, a little bit of reflection, some common language, a little discussion of culture and intersectionality. I'm going to try to do a real brief foray into communicating across cultures, and then examining challenge and challenging bias. Not too ambitious for the next now 50 minutes. We live in a diverse world. There are other ways of seeing the world, solving problems, or working together. And we come from our experience where we know what's right. We know what's right just based on how we grew up. I know that there's only one way to fold a towel. That's just a reality. All towels should be tri-folded before they're put away. If the towel is not folded and folded again, and then folded again and folded again, and put into the linen closet, I can't even use that after a shower. It's just wrong. And we could get into arguments about which way glasses are placed in the cabinet or which way silverware is placed in a strainer. And all of those things we use as examples of people who are convicted on how they are right. And frequently in life, things are neither right or wrong, they're just different. They're just different. And getting outside of ourselves is always a challenge. Excellence and diversity are not mutually exclusive. We want to promote inclusion. We want to create environments where differences and people are valued and supported. And that's a challenge. We can intellectually say that that's what we do, but the proof of it is in how it's being received. And this is where I use my cologne metaphor, that we have to rely on someone else to let you know if you're wearing too much cologne. Because if you take a bath in it, it becomes invisible to you soon. But when you start interacting with other people, you can get the reaction that they are now aware of something where we are no longer aware. And that's why in working together, it's important to hear other voices and not to critique them, not to debate them, but to actually listen to them, hear and process and ask, how does that now inform me in moving forward? Provide opportunities for people to develop their full potential, and that full potential includes our spiritual growth. Yeah, so if we are doing things in church, in congregations, in our larger community, our spiritual community, if we are doing things that get in the way of our working together, that are creating cultural collisions and friction, then that works against our ability of using community as a foundation, as a springboard for our spiritual growth. And that's just one of the challenges that we look at. Some of our basic premises, prejudice is learned and can be unlearned. Cultural collisions are going to occur no matter how proficient one is, no matter how much one has learned. Your respectful dialogue is needed, and respect is something that, again, I can't just intend respect. When I'm in a conversation, we have to mutually get to a place that we're agreeing that this is respectful. Assume goodwill, which is tough. And I'll be honest, I am wrestling right now when I see a lot of things going on in the world with assuming goodwill. Yeah, so I have to re-challenge myself every day in doing that. Okay, there are no easy answers. Change is a process. Diversity is a strength. Allies can change institutions. And so we're looking for exposure, exploration, reflection, some encouragement. I use this as ground rules because I use triples. I don't want to hit home runs. When you hit a home run, you pause at the plate and then you trot around the bases and your work is done. And now you're just basking in the glory of what you've accomplished. In order to hit a triple, you have to make contact followed by hustle. And so if we want to make a difference, it's contact followed by hustle. And so the triples that I'm talking about: trust, people, process, and confidentiality. Respect, treat others not as we think we are treating them respectfully, but as they feel they are being treated respectfully. Include, invite others in, share the stage. If you choose to participate or pass, that's okay, but encourage participation. Listen to learn and understand, not to debate and convince. And that's always a challenge. I know that I play conversational jump rope. I am just waiting and waiting for someone to finish that statement because I have this brilliant thought that I need to share, and they're occupying the stage and wasting time. And as soon as I can jump in, then it's my turn to jump rope. And so I'm not hearing what other people are saying because I'm processing what I'm about to say. Learning to listen is one of the underestimated and undervalued parts of effective communication. Empathize, relate to how other people feel, and sense. Be positive to others' feelings and needs. We really want to encourage in our groups after this to have dialogue and not debate. Dialogue is collaborative, seeks common ground, it listens to understand, it enlarges the viewpoint, it searches for agreement, it remains open. Debate tends to be oppositional, looking for a win, listening to find flaws, and critiquing the conversation. It affirms a viewpoint, it searches for difference, and it seeks a conclusion. This is going to be an open process and a continual growth process. So this is my first moment of reflection. And so I'll give you about a minute, no pressure here, to just reflect on what it was like for you growing up racially. What was it like? Because so much of who we are is informed before we even begin our formal education process. What was your family unit like? What was your neighborhood like? What about the schools that you attended? The activities that you participated in? You know, were you in Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or at the YMCA, or were you in gymnastics? What and how did that inform? Did you travel? Where did you travel? With whom did you travel? All of those things are during our formative years, and much of who we are for the rest of our life happens during that formative space. It's how we start to develop the lens through which we see the world, through which we communicate, through which we interact, and through which we find comfort. Now, I know that in being sheltered, I am seeking comfort food consistently. Okay. And so my comfort food may not be your comfort food, but hey, it's my comfort. So we're going for it. And so a lot of that is informed by the past. When was the first time you realized you were blank? And I don't know everyone who was here. Yeah, I remember that one of my cousins, at a very early age, was sent to the store. And this was back in yesteryear, where young children could be sent to the store. And you could walk a block and at 6 or 7, go to a store and come back. And my cousin came back with the incorrect change. And when he got back, his mom asked, "Who waited on you? Was it the white man or the black man?" And he thought carefully and then responded, "It was the white man with the black face," because he didn't know what they were asking him. It didn't make sense what they were asking him. And so there's a point of realization where we now say, I am white, or I am black, or I am a tribal, I am Cherokee, however we choose to refer. When was that first time? When was the first time you realized that you might be treated differently because you have blank skin? And that differential treatment might be negative or positive, depending on where you are and with whom you were interacting. When was the first time you realized people of other racial identity groups are treated differently? Have we realized that? What were the messages you heard growing up about white people, about African Americans, about Latinos, Latinas, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders? Did you hear messages, or did we model messages? And again, if I were interacting, I could talk about how we can grow up in households where we are saying all the right words, but our body language is saying something else. When I see someone that startles me and I'm with my son or daughter and I squeeze their hand, I don't have to say anything because I've already communicated to my children what my pattern of behavior is when they are in danger. What I do in extending my hand, if I'm stopping short in the car and someone is sitting in the front seat, or what I might do in squeezing a hand or moving them away, am I in tune with all of those ways of communicating that aren't necessarily verbal communication? Look at your friends, family, colleagues, key professionals, or service people, your doctor, your dentist, your lawyer, your counselor, your handy person, what are their racial identities? How and why did you choose to know or work with these people? To which racial groups do the people you socialize with regularly belong? And so these are this is just the foundation of establishing an awareness of what our comfort zone is. Because just like comfort food, we will gravitate towards our comfort zone, especially in times of stress. And with the COVID virus, one of the things that we're seeing the stress fractures of inequality and exclusion. They're being magnified right now, and people are retreating to their comfortable spaces. And that type of stress, and it's sometimes the stress test that reveals our true health. When everything is going well and no one is challenged, then, hey, everything's going well. Yeah, that's why we sometimes undergo that stress test if they want to find out something about our heart. Because in my resting position, it may not reveal some of the challenges that are there. And so that's one of the things that I want us to think about as we move forward. What is my comfort zone? How did that comfort zone come about? Why am I making the choices that I'm making right now? In common language, and I am open to sharing this, so I know that I'm assuming no one is sitting here trying to copy all of this down, but all of the slides and information and additional resources will be forthcoming, if you so desire. Ethnicity refers to particular groups of people from a given geographic region that share some common ancestry, traditions, language, or dialect. Now, one of the things that happens in growing up in the United States is that we perceive the rest of the world as ethnic, but not us. And so ethnicity is not race. If I ask you what you do on Memorial Day, perhaps not this year, then across racial boundaries and gender, we'd be doing pretty much the same thing, I would imagine. 4th of July is an ethnic holiday. See, we don't see it. We just see Cinco de Mayo as an ethnic holiday. Yeah, because it's an other holiday. But I suspect that we would be doing similar things on the 4th of July, similar things on Labor Day, things that other countries are not celebrating because we're celebrating them because they're our ethnic holidays. So there is a commonality. Sometimes when we look at our divisions in the United States, we see the separation. But if you travel to other countries, you start to see that those other countries may look at it and say, oh, I knew all of you were American, because you just walk around with that air. And so whether you have white or black or Latino or white, black, or brown in the group, that group may still be so Americanized in the perception of other people who are sniffing our cologne that they can see right away that there's a difference. These second generation Japanese can go to Japan and see, if you've spent a couple of generations in the US, if you are now a little bit different than someone who has always lived in Japan, or for Italy, or for any number of countries that we could go to and look at that. Culture is the system of shared beliefs and values. And race, when we get to racism, and this is where it's particularly challenging, is a false classification. It is bad science on almost every level. I could do some of the history with Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who went through back in the 1700s and essentially said, there are about 5 different races. Nothing based in science, nothing based in genetics, but there are about 5 different groups. And that has stuck with us. If we wanted to use race as some type of grouping, we'd have in excess of 2,000 races. And so the things that we have and the ways that we categorize really are kind of nonsensical. We share 98.5% common DNA with chimpanzees. What we attribute to race accounts for less than 0.012% of our genetic difference. There is more genetic difference between a tall person and a short person than there is between a black person and a white person. It's just bad science. However, it is a socio-political, socio-economic, socio-cultural construct that has relevance and sometimes life-altering relevance to the people who fall within those constructs. We have defined norms. We'll frequently talk about institutional power and consequently institutional racism. And once we look at institutional power and institutional racism, it doesn't always require someone orchestrating. It's almost like we put it on autopilot and it just runs after that, because the institutional norms will take care of it. Economic power, and there's a myth of scarcity that feeds the whole notion of racism. That if there's not enough to go around, then I want to make sure that me and mine get it, and you and yours don't. And as long as we perpetuate the myth of scarcity, now that's not to say that there aren't times where people don't have as much as others. We see that clearly right now. But that's because in large measure, we have a lot of structural issues that exacerbate that scarcity. It's not that things are scarce, it's that structurally we're not expanding it. We're going through things right now because of supply chain and because of other issues where we're actually dumping thousands of gallons of milk. We are dumping millions of pounds of potatoes. There's food that's going to be available. We have more than sufficient supplies of meat, but we can't process the meat. And so distribution networks, a number of things get in the way and exacerbate our perception that things are scarce. There's violence, there's internalized oppression, invisibility, and I'll just share this briefly. In doing a workshop, we had a focus group, and part of the focus group were young Native Americans. And, excuse me, that is, I turned my cell phone off. And the young Native Americans were asked about the mascots for teams and if that bothered them. And they said no. And that was surprising to the group that was meeting. And in further conversation, we asked, well, there's been a lot of discussion about it being stereotypical and demeaning. And they said, yes, we agree with that. But the alternative is to be invisible, which is worse. And so when we look at that conversation, ignoring or denying the existence, histories, and achievements of certain groups is problematic. And so if we now have young people who will accept being demeaned rather than being invisible, it's something that we at least have to concern ourselves with. I'm going to just skip ahead here because isolation, well, that's timely, a necessary component of oppression that frames injustice in terms of individuals rather than recognizing commonalities among members of a group or between groups. And then individual solutions, seeking to create change at an individual level rather than at a level of social change. And so it starts, and we'll talk about this just briefly, that it starts at an individual level, but we can't stay stuck there. As a church body, we can't remain in a place where we're not challenging things systemically. And it starts with our system. And again, I put this in here twice because I want to come back to that myth of scarcity. We can structure things so that there's enough to go around. And when there's not enough to go around, That's because it's a structural impediment, not an actual scarcity. So there are differences in predilection and prejudice and discrimination, but racism is a set of societal, cultural, and institutional beliefs and practices, regardless of intention, that subordinate and oppress one race for the benefit of another. And this is what's key, and a key distinguishing feature between racism, which is often conflated with prejudice or discrimination. Racism requires not only the belief in the superiority of one group over another, which discrimination doesn't necessarily have and prejudice doesn't necessarily have, but also the power to act on that belief. And that's what makes it racist. I usually share up front, but I was just kind of racing, so I forgot to let everyone on Zoom right now know that Freemans are actually superior people. And I don't say that to put any of you down. I know you're trying your best and doing your best, but we just are. We're just better people, and probably by every measure. And so it's easy, because I'm seeing some smiles, to kind of laugh that off. But it wouldn't be funny if I truly believed it and I had power over your income, your livelihood, where you lived, how you traveled, the goods and services available in your neighborhood, your access to health care, or any number of factors, or even your ability to vote. Then now it's not so funny. Now it's not amusing. And that's the difference between discrimination. I can openly discriminate. Do I have the power to reinforce and back up that discrimination? Now, sometimes we will hear that people of color can't, or the oppressed can't be racist. And I would respectfully disagree. Generally don't have the institutional power for systemic racism. But if I walk into my classroom, I have power. And on an individual level, if I can act on that. And that's for the same reason that we wouldn't automatically give a pass on whether or not women can be sexist. Because when we look at institutional sexism, that again, once those isms are put in place, we can support them almost unwittingly. And so women can continue the process of sexism and supporting it, even if it's working against them, because it's part of our comfort zone. It's part of how we grew up. It's what we know, and that's where some of the challenge comes in. So another thought exercise. This is what I would like you to do. Think about who you are. And I would ask the question, who am I? And I put some of these bubbles up just to give you some categories to help streamline the process. Who are you in terms of significant, in terms of membership? We all belong to something. So you can't choose ELCA right now because we're all on board with that. Who are you in terms of education? That's I have a PhD. Okay, I'm glad that I did it. It's something that I wanted to do. I'm not all that swept up in it. I do know people who make their children call them doctor. I mean, that is just, they're all pumped up. I am Dr. such and stuff, and everything I say is relevant. Who are you in terms of your significant decade? Not your age, but just the decade of your influence. Some of us are 60s folks or maybe 70s folks. You can be 75 and you could be a 90s person. Who are you in terms of religion? We've kind of addressed that. Who are you in terms of your physical characteristics? I grew up as a short kid with freckles, hated both. Hated both, informed a lot of my behavior. Hated freckles in particularly because I was the only child in my neighborhood who had them. And so I was constantly explaining or having people run from me, and that I tried to get them out with bleach on my skin. And so as a child, I was going to actually harm myself, fortunately not very much, because of something that I didn't like. And people around me didn't help. Adults who said, "Ooh, has anyone ever tried to connect all those dots?" Just further, they didn't do it to be cruel. They did it to be funny, but it just wasn't funny to me. Who are we in terms of significant experiences? Who are we in terms of gender? And what does that mean when we talk about gender? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? If I am gay or lesbian, what does that mean? How does that inform my behavior? What are the constraints? Who am I in terms of race or ethnicity? And if you're thinking about this, what I want you to do is choose the 3 bubbles that say the most about who you are. You don't get 2, you don't get 4. Which 3 say the most about who you are as you know yourself? Dead space on Zoom is a little bit different than dead space in the classroom. And now I would ask, of the bubbles that you see, which ones are immediately obvious when you meet someone? And everyone is muted, so you can talk, or if you have something to share. Okay. But it's kind of hard. I'm teaching class online, and so a lot of the class that I'm teaching, the students don't want to say anything. So I don't know, and they don't even have their videos up. They just have the name, so I don't even know if they're there. I'm just talking into the computer. But
characteristics and gender are very obvious.
Physical characteristics, which ones again?
Gender and race. Those are obvious things that one can see before you even open your mouth.
Okay, and so race, gender, physical characteristics are the ones that I generally get as answers of the things that we can see. But
I would say maybe even just challenging that a little bit. When some years ago, I was walking with a friend who was Asian in a neighborhood, and we went into a market, an Asian market, because there was something there she wanted. And when we came out, I turned to her and I said, we were the only 2 white people in the store. And I turned and I looked at her and I went, oh my God, I was the only white person in the store. And when I said that to her, she goes, I was feeling really uncomfortable too, as if I were not part of the group that was in this store, even though she looked like them and I didn't. And so, so that really got me thinking about race and how we identify. And she grew up in a family where she was adopted into a white family. And
that is,
she didn't experience her Asian culture and her Asian identity the same way that other folks might. And I didn't see her as Asian. I saw her as white, which was really an interesting thing. So there was that. And then
I don't want to, I really would love to hear more.
Okay.
I have only 15 minutes left.
Okay.
But I appreciate your sharing that. I really do, because that's the part, and this is where I would love to have more discussion on that, because you mentioned, and I think which was good, the aspect of growing up culturally again. And so what our perception is on race gets back to this idea, it's always more than what you see. It's always more than what you see. And in this particular case, that race isn't always obvious, because people self-identify in ways that may not be immediately obvious. I spend a great part of my life having people ask, what am I? In doing workshops, or where were you born? And that is, what is your background? And what is your ethnicity, or what is your race? And so there are, within what we describe as the African-American community, you have every skin color, you have every lip thickness and thinness, you have every hair texture, you have every eye color, within that community. And it's estimated that there are a minimum of 10 million people in the US who perceive themselves to be white, who have sufficient African ancestry to qualify for being Black, but don't necessarily know it. And that is, so it's an interesting mix. And gender may or may not be obvious, because if I brought in two 18-month-old toddlers and dressed them identically and asked them as they were standing in front of the room, which is the boy and which is the girl, we wouldn't know if we don't get to see how they play or what they do. But once I know which is the boy and which is the girl, do I treat them differently? Do I have different sets of expectations? I was in Sunday school a few years ago, and one of the young girls in the pre-K class had red sparkly shoes, and she was showing them off. And she said, "I have my sparkly shoes. I have my sparkly shoes." And I looked at them and I said, "Those are great. Those are great. I have some just like that at home." And she said, "I'm 3 years old." "No, you don't. Boys don't have sparkly shoes." And so we start to look at how we draw the distinctions and the expectations that we have. Do we treat young boys and girls differently because they ask to be treated differently, or because we choose to treat them differently? And physical characteristics may be obvious, but then what do we do with that when we have that information? This is what I would offer, and again, wish I could expand on the conversation. Rarely have I ever seen anyone in answering the three things that say the most about who they are. They do not choose race, gender, and physical characteristics. One of them, sometimes two of them, almost never those three as the most significant identifiers of who they are. And what that means is that we know in ourselves that I am much more than what you can possibly see. But of course, I make my judgment about you based on the things that I see, because I know I'm entirely accurate in interpreting who you are based on my observation and perception of race, gender, and physical characteristics. I spent some time in a wheelchair, and as a result of surgery, so I was in a wheelchair for a few months. And as I was traveling, going to bookstores, people helping me out a little bit, people would come and stand in front of me while I'm at the bookstore, because now I was invisible. I'm browsing here. And then that's, "Oh, okay, excuse me." And then other people would come and ask my cousin who was helping me how I'm doing. Like I wasn't there. Okay. So how's he doing? And so a lot of things about what we see inform some of the things that we may do. So, but that brings us to privilege. And again, I apologize for just the nature of doing this drive-by, but I'm accelerating a bit here. When we talk about privilege, Peggy McIntosh wrote about privilege, and it becomes a conversation frequently just about white privilege. But it's a larger conversation about privilege that we sometimes need to reflect on. It's an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. An invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks that greet me without any effort on my part. And where privilege now becomes problematic is that privilege doesn't say that people don't work hard, that they don't struggle. But there are aspects, for me, there is male privilege in this society. I can walk around and protest that there isn't. I've worked hard and I've gone to school and I've done all of these things, but I get some advantages just in my maleness. Sometimes in credit, sometimes in safety, sometimes in the amount of respect that's afforded me. When I've been a co-facilitator Yeah, in a world of difference, we generally try to team a man and a woman. And I've worked rooms where, and been in meetings in business where people did not hear what the women had to say. And a man could repeat the same thing 5 minutes later, and now it becomes a brilliant idea. And so those are things about privilege, but it's not until we see that we have privileges. And there are some things, heterosexual privilege, male privilege. This is still, if you're going to be in the US, Christian is a greater privilege than other religions. Just if you look at how holidays are organized, how things are done structurally, there is some privilege that's built in there that precedes who we are as individuals. Privilege equals power. Privilege perceived and actual. Intersectionality is a term that's coined by the rights activist Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender. And what's important about that is that frequently we get caught in just the discussion of white privilege without understanding that there's an intersectionality of privileges and deficits that are going on. And that becomes an important part. People struggle daily with inequalities and privileges that come with their multi identities. So to be white and to be female is to have privilege, and then in some situations, a loss of privilege. Yeah, to be male and African American, may, although it doesn't always, especially given recent current events, come with privilege, but in some cases, privilege and deficit. And so rather than get too caught up, although we need to have in the discussion of racism, the discussion of white privilege, it's also important to understand that's not the only privilege that we are afforded. And then sometimes there's the privilege that we may know something about, that we had nothing to do with developing. I'm looking at a library behind some of our participants. And I have, if I took down this screen that I have behind me, I have books. I was in a book club that my mother put me in. I didn't buy any of the encyclopedias that were in my house. I didn't order them, nor did I request them. The places that we traveled and the exposure, she took me to museums. My dad worked on the road. She took me to the library. And so those are things that were done for me that created a foundation of who I am and what I'm able to do. It was not just my own work. And so I'm always uncomfortable when people tell me about what they did and they did it themselves, because we do nothing alone. We are not raised in the woods by wolves, and then all of a sudden we're free to roam about. So much of who we are is because others helped us with the foundation of who we are. And so it's not so much about privilege, because we're all going to continue to have privilege. We're not going to move to this society where everyone is exactly the same. So it's not about privilege, and it's not about giving up privilege. It's about giving up the exclusivity of privilege. That I have privilege and I don't want you to have access to the privilege that I have. And that becomes the challenge. When men start to give up, and that approach for inclusion, and this is the difficult part of it. There is perceived loss when you give up the exclusivity of privilege. But if we want society to grow, if we want the church to grow, the exclusivity of privilege is going to be a problem, because we lose talent, we lose the ability to adapt, we're less flexible, we are pressured always to be right. There's spiritual isolation that can flow from that. There's a lack of challenge to values and ideas. We're less able to confront new situations. So we have a lot of power when we socially get more power when we give up the exclusivity of privilege. And it seems like that's not going to be the case, but it actually does work out that way. There's something called white fragility, and I'm just going to put that in the Google Dr. Robin DiAngelo. I'm going to hit that later. Deconstructing white privilege. And she speaks about, you know, some of the reactions and the responses of being white in the dismantling racism conversation, and where we may be reluctant or resistant. So if we want to dismantle racism, we want to dismantle oppression, because oppression is greater than just racism, then we must be about building a movement for social and economic justice and change. We have to be about building a movement for social and economic justice and change. And again, this pandemic that we're experiencing right now has really revealed a lot of the structural challenges. And at this moment, as we're trying to figure out how to move forward, we either get back to the way things used to be, which is let me get back to normal, but sometimes getting back to normal is not necessarily getting back to a good place, especially when we have new information and new revelations that are coming up. So real quickly, communication is just impossible. I don't understand how it happens. That is, if I could then do the show of hands, I could ask, how many of you have ever been misunderstood by someone in your immediate family? And you can just nod your head. Or misunderstood someone in your immediate family. So in a place where we speak the same language, maybe the same religion, maybe the same geographic background, maybe where we have every capacity to get it right, we still get it twisted. And then we go out in public and in different environments where people are coming from different backgrounds, different ages, different religions, and we think that we're not going to have confusion. Communication is taking my thoughts and feelings, encoding them based on my process, my secret encoding process, sending them through filters of culture and privilege to someone else's secret decoder, which is not like my encoder, and then turning it into thoughts and feelings, and then hoping that the two match. And it's, to me, it's like people throwing darts at each other and hoping that the points will hit somewhere in the middle. Not likely. So when we're wrestling with some of these thorny issues, that communication runs into language differences, place, physical environment, existing technology. I could ask you how many of you are hand talkers. That is, some people on the phone are still talking with their hands. We can't see that, okay? But it's just part of how we communicate. So some of us prefer an in-face meeting. I'm one of them, to a phone call, because I lose a lot of the communication process, the thought processing, the nonverbal communication, all of those things. And so there are issues of touching. And what that means, okay, is it reinforcement, hello, goodbye, intimacy, demand for attention, something creepy, okay, that is, or marking time. When do we start? Yes, some cultures are what we call monochronic, some are polychronic. Monochronic cultures are, we will start on time. Polychronic say, we will start when everyone's here. Because we value the group over the time as opposed to the time over the group. Which is right, which is wrong. They each have a different set of norms to follow in order to make it function. And they both function, but they don't easily coexist. Making space. Well, see, this graphic is now about to change radically. So this was my pre-pandemic graphic on what is intimate space, public space, social space. Now, intimate space is anything inside of 6 feet. Okay, you just need to back up. You need to back up. We're not even going to be a close talker right now. 6 feet is close enough. But people operate differently. And so we all know people who are close talkers. And that in some cultures, you want to be close enough to feel the breath of the other person on your face. Well, this is not happening now at any time in the foreseeable future. But you have collisions when I can't hear you because you're too close to me. And all I'm thinking of is not what you're saying, but why are you so close? And we have differences in what we call paralanguage, the way we say things,
Race.
contact, in body posture,
Right.
that's kinesic,
All
symbolic. What is
all
the
these-
comfortable distancing, the timing and pacing of speech patterns? All of those are issues. Then we have gestures. What do they mean? Okay, is that the peace sign? Or is that two? Or is that an obscene gesture, which it is in some countries? Is thumbs up a positive thing for everyone? It may be now because of Facebook, but that is not always the case. Yeah, is the okay sign? Is that a 3? Is that a 0? Is it okay? Is it an obscene gesture? Is it a gang sign? Pointing. Can I point at an adult with a single finger? Impolite in a number of societies. So we have communication issues that we at least need to be aware of. We can't do a workshop that makes everything make sense right in this short time. But courtesy, sequencing, phasing, simplicity, objectivity, specificity, assertiveness. I could ask, how many of you like to be frank, like to be candid, like to be direct? Not me. Take me out to dinner and beat around the bush. Okay. If you like it that way, doesn't mean everyone else likes it that way. And sometimes we get caught up in the idea of equal treatment versus equitable treatment. In equal treatment, I treat everyone the same way. In equitable treatment, I treat them according to his or her needs. And that requires a different level of thought and a different level of processing in order to make that happen. So just skipping ahead, because I want to close this out with, there's some common elements of oppression, personal, cultural, or institutional. And when we look at this cycle of racist oppression, we have dissonance in that path to liberation, but we learn racism through misinformation, missing history, biased history, stereotypes. We reinforce it through a socialization process, and socialization versus intellectualization. Socialization is extremely powerful. In fact, we are at times in conflict with what we know and how we react. And we could ask how many of us, I know I have been in the middle of a negative reaction to something, even though I know better, but I'm going down that path anyway, because I revert to how I was socialized under pressure. Socialization is what you give up when you're squeezed. Intellectualization is how you respond when you're comfortable and you have a moment to reflect on what you're going to do. So when my button gets pushed, socialization. But experience in racist institutions, white supremacist culture, personal interactions. And then internalization is that regardless of whether we're male or female or white or black, we can internalize racist structure and continue to support it because it's, again, oddly part of what we know and part of our comfort zone. And that's what we have to challenge, both as on an individual level and on a church level. In any type of interaction, we may have 4 types of people that are there. One is the target of the oppression. The other is the perpetrator. But that's not the only thing. We have a confronter, which I'm not licensing or authorizing anyone to do. I'm going to suggest a video that you can find online called Ouch, That Stereotype Hurts, on ways that we can interrupt. And then you have the bystander who just saw it happen. And so how do we move to make sure that we don't want to be the perpetrator, and nor do we want to be the target? But more often than either of those, we can potentially be the bystander or the person who's going to have some strategic ability to intervene. So in inclusion, sometimes the complexities of prejudice and discrimination seem to be so overwhelming that it just feels like there's nothing I can do. Throw my hands up, what can I do? But silence is an action. Being a bystander is a choice and it's an action. So the challenge we have to get is, how do we develop the tools so that we can be effective in intervening? Because we are not issuing capes where we go out and stamp out prejudice and racism and discrimination wherever we see it. No one will be flashing the inclusion signal in the sky at night, waiting for us to change and rush to that. But there are strategic ways that we can approach that. When it comes to this, though, part of our conversation needs to be, because in ELCA, we are heavily white. Okay, there's just no way around determining or recognizing that fact. And so when we have this conversation, then denial, minimization, blame, lack of intent, it's over now. Slavery was 150 years ago. And that is, my great-great-grandmother was a former slave. And my dad spoke to her. And she had conversations with him as he was a teenager about what it was like with slavery and having her oldest daughter sold from her and witnessing lynchings. And so it may seem like 150 years ago, but sometimes that history still informs our present. There are some obstacles: resistance to change, paternalism, scapegoating, blaming, continued oppression, resistance. And what I want to do is look at and have as part of this larger conversation that we can get to of how we're going to overcome these obstacles. Where are the others? It's not just about an instant solution or a distinguished lecturer, that we have to do the work. And that work is going to be day to day. It's going to be frustrating. It's going to be filled with setbacks. It's going to be filled with just doing heavy lifting just to move something an inch. But this is the question. If we are not doing it, then who is it that we are waiting for to do it? Or are we comfortable with it not being done? So I want to close with just a couple of things in moving forward. One is recognizing our comfort zone, building interracial relationships, church-to-church relationships, inviting people into the conversation, encourage our children, patronize businesses that have fair hiring, learn more about race relations and history, and pay attention to politics in your community. Not to necessarily be political from the pulpit, but to pay attention. We cannot go into the church building and act as if the things happening in the community are not relevant to the people who are coming into the church building. Whether they're in our congregation now, we now live in a global community, and we are preparing young people to live in a world that we may not fully understand. I'm not even sure how to prepare people to live in a post-COVID world, much less anything else that is coming on after that. So the Google machine, the house we live in, Race, the Power of an Illusion. You can find that on YouTube, and that would be helpful to watch. If you may or may not be familiar with the Clark-Dow test, because that's in part talks about the socialization process, where young Black children, and giving a choice between a black doll and a white doll, will still today, you say that the white doll is the pretty doll and the black doll is the bad doll. Not as much as it was back in the 50s when the test was first done, but there are some, you can Google that. Ouch, that stereotype hurts gives some suggestions on things that we can do when we are witnessing racism or discrimination or just undesirable behavior. That, you know, Dr. Robin DiAngelo has some videos out there on deconstructing white privilege that are worth looking at. And Miss Joy Angela DeGruy also has some videos if you Google those. And the thing about just Googling any of that is that the Google machine is wonderful by giving you a million other things that you might look at that go along with it. Google, Amazon, about the same, I think, in that respect. If you remember, these are some things to ask a question when someone is saying something and doing something that is, hey, just, you don't have to, hey, stop that. Okay, ask a question. Okay, well, what do you mean? Okay. Or interrupt and then redirect the conversation. Broaden it to universal I'm not sure that that's just, I think maybe everyone does that. Or make it an individual. Well, I think that's only something that Frank is into. He's not representing the entire group. Or if you can't do any of those things, just say ouch. Just say ouch. What you would say if someone stepped on your toe. And if someone is standing on your foot and then you feel like it would be impolite to ask them to not stand on your foot, I don't know what I can do with that. But when someone steps on our cultural toe, it's okay to say ouch. And just to let them know that that's part of what happened. So if I'm going to, what I'd like to do, and I was trying to get this to an hour, and I'm going to, this is just a few minutes, and it talks a little bit about healing, and I'm going to kind of shut it down. And I can be reached, okay, the bishop has my information. If any of you want to have a conversation, then I would love to continue the conversation. I would love to hear from you, Megan, about more. And I hated to interrupt, but that was, the time clock was just being oppressive and had to yield you to that. And if I ever get to come out of my cave, then I would love to visit. And if there's any way that I can be helpful, then I'd be more than happy to do that. But I'm going to share this YouTube and then we'll close that and move on.
I like to go see movies. Everybody knows I'm a movie person, but I always go to see movies that aren't they're just fantastic kind of, you know, cinematography stuff. I don't want reality because I deal too much with reality. So I deliberately went because at this particular time, it was King Kong. My fault. I own it. I go to see King Kong. And the only reason why, you know, of course I had seen it, the earlier versions, but the cinematography for this new one was phenomenal. All the mechanics and all the new stuff. King Kong was doing all kind of amazing stuff. So I decided I was going to go. So I'm in, I don't know, at Baltimore. I don't know where I am traveling. And I'm with this friend of mine named Dennis. So we go in. I didn't realize the movie was 3 hours. First of all, I had to go to the bathroom when I got in. So I had to get out. And so I'm trying to figure out when during the movie do I run out. So I decided it's a big bug scene, Jurassic bugs. I don't like little bugs, certainly don't like big ones. So I decided this is a good time to run out. So I run out. And as I'm running out, this is like the first day opening. So it's like 5 theaters of King Kong. So this guy runs out with his son, white man. He's like mid-30s and he's got this son, looks about 8 or 10. So they're running out and I'm going, whoa, that was out of control. The bug scene. He goes, oh boy, was it? I said, yeah, that was clearly the worst part so far. So the father runs in, but his son stops and goes, yeah, I didn't like those black people. And I'm going, why me? Is it me? Do I have like a sign on me, right? And then the kid runs in the bathroom. So I go back in the show and I tell Dennis what just happened, and Dennis falls out laughing. He goes, Joy, this only happens to you. And I'm going, but because there's a scene where and here's the thing about it. This is so amazing about the scene. There's a scene of cannibals, but they're not black people. They're all kind of people. And they, you know, right now they got to be politically correct. So you had Asians, and they zoomed in so you could see even the main character was a blonde woman with blue eyes. But they physically were all black, even though they represented different ethnicities. Because, you know, they couldn't have all black people, and they're not in, you know, this age. So, but the little boy, he couldn't see that subtlety. So I'm sitting there, now I'm upset because I couldn't process. And Dennis goes, Joe, you can't process this. It's over, it's done. There are thousands of people. You're never going to be able to fix this, right? So I'm sitting here, I'm messed up for the rest of the movie. So the movie is over, we walk out, and there are droves of people coming out. And who do you think is standing there leaning on the rail? Was this man and his son. And I say, Dennis, this is a man. He goes, no way. I said, yes, Wade, that's him. So I walk over to the man and I said, do you remember me? He says, yeah, you ran out during the bug scene. Well, they were waiting for the daughter to come out of the bathroom. That's why we were leaning, waiting at the room. I said, can I ask your son something? He says, certainly. So I say to the little boy, I said, you know, now that you've seen the whole movie, you know, because, you know, King Kong bites it in the end. I'm figuring that's pretty bad. I said, what do you think the worst part of the movie was now? He goes, those black people. And his father goes, whoa, you know, I'm sure. Well, yeah, they were. You know, he was so the father. I said, listen, I know your son's not a Nazi. Don't worry about it. That's not what the issue. And the son runs off. I said, the issue here is that they weren't all black people, but that's his image. Because you see, it wasn't the monsters that were horrific. It was those people were. And that's the image in his mind. And he's so young, he couldn't see that there were actually different groups of people as those cannibals. He only saw black people. And his father, you could just see, was tortured. He says, I don't know. This problem is so big. I don't know if we can ever make it right. And I said, you see, now we're having another conversation, he and I. He goes, it's just so big. I don't know if we can make it right. I said, perhaps. I said, I have to believe that we can. And so his daughter runs out, and now he has a son and his daughter. And he's disturbed, though, you can tell. And he's walking away, and Dennis looks at me, and I look at Dennis. And he gets to the escalator, and he stops, and he takes both of his children, and he turns around, and he walks back to me, and he says, but I will make it right with them, because I can make it right with them. You see, that's where the healing begins, you know. That's where, those moments.
So I thank you so much for your attentiveness.
Okay, thank you. We just have a few minutes, so I do want to just, if you're okay, Terrence, just
Yes.
a few minutes to, if people have a question, if they want to put it in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll rely on the other staff to help me look at the multiple screens. Does anybody want to ask a question of Terrence? And all of this will be on the Senate website. And as well as Terrence's contact information. Anyone want to?
And more resources. I have, if you're looking for resources or for doing workshops or activities or icebreakers or any of those things, when we start to have conversations, and that's, then we can get you resources for doing that. It won't be a drive-by.
Okay, and part of what we did recognize that this is, and I love your analogy, Terrence, that this is a drive-by. Hopefully this is giving us just some things to just think about. And that's why we invited you also into reading a book and having further conversations. Some of you have chosen to have conversation partners. Some of you have chosen to just kind of have your own reflections. Next Monday, Pastor Amy Appel will be with us. She's with us today, and she will help us as we continue to think. And then following this, if you noticed, there will also be opportunities for you to join a smaller group conversation. Again, this is just kind of letting some things percolate and thinking about some things, but in no way are we thinking that this is going to, quote unquote, solve anything. And I love your triples that we just want to start the conversation, begin this journey, because we have a lot of work to do. As you know, the ELCA is one of the widest mainline denominations for all of our commitment.
If I may share one thing and start conversations, it's important to be honest in the conversation, but before we can be totally honest in the conversation, we have to build trust in the process for being honest in the conversation. So there are two things that are sometimes problematic as we move forward in these conversations. One is to stay at such a milquetoast level that I just call it diversity 101, and then we just keep repeating that. So we never get to anything substantive, and we never really have to use the ground rules because we're not being honest. The other is to try to race into, well, I'm part of the choir, so we're just going to jump headlong into this conversation without taking some time, even if it feels like you don't need to take the time. It's what I call stretching before you exercise.
Mm.
When I was younger, I could just wake up and then go run. Now I can't even walk without stretching. So you've got to do some of that warm up in order to get there. Otherwise, we set the process back.
Thank you. Good thoughts.
Bishop, if I may
Yep.
just say a little bit, because one of the questions in the chat, and I don't know if everybody's seeing that, what I'm hoping to address next week is some practical kind of conversation about, so how do I take this back to my congregation, my preaching specifically, and how do I take that then, what Terry's talking about, and really get a cat on the computer. How do I take that then to the practical work of my parish ministry? So that's what I'm really hoping to talk about some next week. So
Great.
stay tuned.
Right. And I think that there will be also additional resources again on the website of how you can take this into your congregation. But the topic of this, it begins with us. We need to start talking with one another. We need to start talking, and with honesty and respect and listening. So that was the hope, to invite us into this time with each other. And some of the things that you're beginning to kind of surface, let's find places among one another that we can begin. So I think, unless anybody has any last burning question, we're going to bring this time to a close. And again, thank you so much, Terrence. And, you can tell he's an expert. He just kept going. I was trying to figure out how to find that person and mute that person and not mute you. And you just kept going. So, boy, you can teach all of us.
I know because I do the Zoom for our church service. So I'm constantly stopping sharing and starting sharing and back and forth from one person. But when you have a lot of people, I'm only seeing 6 on the screen at a time. And someone is doing something and I can't find them. Yeah. And as I go looking for them, then I stop scrolling for the person who's speaking. And so it'll be interesting to see. I suspect Zoom is going to be here to stay, because there's a lot of power in it. And to think about, rather than paying for hotels and transportation and spending time on the road, there'll be a lot of things we can accomplish, but it's still a learning curve.
Yes. So thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. God's blessing on the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see many of you back next Monday with Pastor Appel to continue this. And I hope those of you that are part of conversation groups, that as you're reading, that you'll have good conversation with one another. And just a reminder that if you need some assistance setting up some Zoom meetings, we can certainly do that. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to end the meeting for everyone. Thank you so much. Again, have a blessed day.
I have lots of time on my hand, so give me a call if you want, because I got time.